It has been started.
Okay. Good morning, viewers in United States, and good morning, our viewers and audience in India. We are here yet again for one more event in our distinguished lecture series organized by the Council for Strategic Affairs. And today we have a topic which we have been kind of pursuing over the last 3 months on maritime security in Indo-Pacific. So all of you must have seen our announcement. We are going to be talking on rules-based order, RBO, and maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, that is very important when we say Indo-Pacific region, that's the flag of India. A little bit about the Council for Strategic Affairs. Council for Strategic Affairs imparts education in the field of international relations and strategic studies. CSA fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. CSA encourages strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. And finally, CSA condemns terrorism in all its forms worldwide, no selectivity. We have certain activities. We have a monthly roundtable discussion on second Monday of each month at 8 p.m. Eastern Day Time. We have a monthly guest lecture under our distinguished lecture series by a domain expert. CSA also organizes symposia, meetings, and conferences, and CSA promotes publication of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. And our distinguished speaker today is retired Admiral Pradeep Chauhan. Admiral Pradeep Chauhan is currently the Director General of a think tank called National Maritime Foundation. And I just heard that he had organized a 3-day conference on the same topic of Indo-Pacific. You are going to see Admiral Chauhan live soon in our broadcast. But this is his picture. He is an alumnus of the National Defense Academy, Defense Staff College. He had a BSc, MSc, and MPhil degree. He was Vice Admiral, and he is currently Director General of the National Maritime Foundation in New Delhi. He retired in November 2013 after an illustrious service. This included a stint in Antarctica as also a 3-year deputation to the government of Mauritius, where he set up and commanded the Mauritius National Coast Guard. His seagoing service incorporates as many as 4 command appointments. After doing the 42nd NDC, he was the Principal Director of Naval Operations and thereafter went to command the Indian Navy's sole aircraft carrier of that period, the Virat. As a Rear Admiral, he was the Navy's first Assistant Chief of the Naval Staff, where he conceptualized and executed the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, IONS. As Vice Admiral, he has been Chief of Staff of the Western Naval Command and was, in his last naval appointment before retirement, commandant of the Indian Naval Academy. He has been commended 3 times by the President of India for sustained and distinguished service, and he has remained very active after his retirement in the intellectual think tank circuit. He is very much sought sought-after thought leader and leadership mentor. And that is why one of the reasons he is here to educate us about this particular topic. Apart from being on the visiting faculty of the higher command establishments of all three of India's defense services, as also tri-service establishments such as the College of Defense Management, Hyderabad, and the National Defense College, New Delhi. He has also been advising the government through the interaction with integrated headquarters of the Ministry of Defense and Navy and the Ministry of External Affairs and National Security Council Secretariat. He is also a prolific writer and has more than 95 professional articles and papers, and a respected advisor and fellow of several important think tanks. And I must say that we are very honored to have him present the distinguished lecture series oration for the Council for Strategic Affairs. This presentation was actually scheduled almost 2 months ago. We have had a series of presentations on maritime security and Indo-Pacific, starting with Commodore Watson, who talked about the concept of ocean sovereignty and China's aircraft carrier program and its strategic implications in August of this year. We had a presentation by Admiral Sanatan Kulshrestha on AUKUS, Quad, and the maritime security of Indo-Pacific. And we are topping this series with today's presentation on rules-based organization and maritime security of Indo-Pacific. I just cannot, emphasize the importance of this topic, because yesterday in Times of India, there was a statement by the External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar, to Indo-Pacific Business Forum, in which he highlighted the concept of rules-based order and maritime security in the Indo-Pacific region. So I know at CSA we are going in the right direction by organizing some of these presentations. There are some housekeeping rules. Before I invite Admiral Chauhan, I would like everyone to keep on mute to avoid noise interference. I would like people to change their cell phone setting to vibration modes only. We don't want anyone to interrupt our esteemed speaker while he's speaking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to pose questions. So we don't allow anonymous joiners who just use a telephone number without giving their name or without using the video function to ask questions. Please send all your questions by using chat function. Please be very precise and specific in asking a question. Please do not send comments in the form of a monologue. And lastly, we are recording this event, so it would be available on our YouTube channel for viewing within 24 hours. So without further ado, I invite our honored and distinguished speaker, Admiral Pradeep Chauhan, to, give his considered and deliberative views on this very important security topic, RBO and maritime security of the Indo-Pacific region. Admiral Chauhan, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adityanji, and let me express my gratitude at the very outset to the Council for Strategic Affairs. I know it's a morning start for many of you, and we ourselves have just finished, as Dr. Adityanji was gracious enough to mention, a 3-day event at in New Delhi. A couple of words first about the National Maritime Foundation. This is India's foremost think tank that concentrates wholly and solely upon the maritime domain, all aspects of it. We are deeply honored by the presence of many of our country's luminaries and many luminaries from abroad, including Commodore Vasan, who runs the National Maritime Foundation chapter in Tamil Nadu, quite in addition to wearing the hat of the C3S in Chennai. So the National Maritime Foundation is pretty much the only game in town for comprehensive understanding of what India is or isn't doing in the maritime domain. And now I know that the CSA has lots of extremely erudite members, and I am privileged to have read many of the reports being sent on the subject. I just wanted to start my presentation by one comment, really. And while I put the slide share on, I wanted to say that over the next 100 or 200 years, not after, but over, these are going to be a century or two of the seas. And so India is either going to be a maritime power, or India is not going to be any kind of power. And therefore, while the trans-Himalayan areas grab our attention and our media's hyperventilation, that's not where the future of competition, confrontation, conflict possibly lies. So consequently, since India is struggling to become a $5 trillion economy in short order, this can only happen if India's trade keeps picking up, because currently India's merchandise trade to GDP ratio stands at about 36%. And that is notwithstanding two factors. Number one, that this is merchandise trade and does not include services. And number two, that there has been a 4-year global slowdown, and a particularly vicious one in the last 2 years thanks to COVID. And despite that, we have more than a third of our GDP being contributed to by our external trade. And since 95% of our external trade flows by sea, if you take it by volume, and 77% by value, we are, to all intents and purposes, ladies and gentlemen, an island nation. Now, the question to be asked of us and of you is, in this island nation, where are the islanders? Where is the islandic thought? And therefore, if we are to continue to prosper and grow, we definitely need to pick up our trade, we need to improve our fisheries, we need to improve our resource exploitation, we need to be mindful of the requirements of sustainable exploitation and sustainable harvesting of resources. All this has to be done on a continuous basis, and all of that has as its prerequisite a foundational requirement of having predictable rules that apply at sea and that are capable of being understood, anticipated, and adhered to by one and all. So the first question that I wanted to raise was, of course, what is meant by a maritime rules-based order? In other words, ye cheez hai kya? And therefore, perhaps it is best to address that head on. So a rules-based order at sea implies internationally accepted rules, processes, procedures, and I want to emphasize that I have a great focus in my presentation upon China, and therefore all these internationally accepted rules, processes, and procedures are those which China has formally, publicly, and repeatedly committed itself to adhere to. And these rules, processes, and procedures are those that enable, promote, and sustain safe, secure, and predictable maritime activity. So if you the bedrock of all these maritime rules and the rules-based order being flouted by China in the South China Sea and increasingly in the Indian Ocean, they rely upon the bedrock is actually the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which, having been convened in New York in 1973, ended 9 years later with the conclusion in 1982 of what must be defined and described as a grand bargain. Lots and lots of compromises leading to what many people call the Constitution of the Seas. So let me try and explain some elements of that which will bear upon this whole business of the rules-based order. Not very many people understand that there are significant differences between borders and boundaries on the land and borders and boundaries at sea. So I thought I'd rush through this very quick lesson on that. And this is, of course, the depiction of the land. And now we have some line, which is our reference line from which distances to seaward are measured. That reference line is called our baseline. And the baseline generally coincides with the low water mark on the large-scale charts used for that nation, by that nation for navigation. These are promulgated, they are placed, promulgated to the United Nations, they are promulgated globally, and they are either accepted or they are contested. India signed the UNCLOS on the 10th of December 1982, pretty much on the same day as did China, and ratified the UNCLOS as indicated on your lines, in 9. So if you now look from the baseline, measure 12 nautical miles to seaward, where 1 nautical mile, of course, as everybody knows, is 1.852 kilometers, you will get the breadth of what is known as our territorial sea. In this territorial sea, all Indian laws apply. The full majesty of India's laws apply, and that of every other country in their respective territorial sea, except as modified by the right of innocent passage. Landward of the baseline are those waters known as internal waters. In internal waters, there are no rights. There are only those laws which apply to you as defined by the Indian legislative process. And therefore, our maritime border is not our coastline. Everybody talks about the 7,516 kilometers of coastline, but that's not our border. Our border lies a further 12 nautical miles to seaward of that. And then, as I mentioned, there is no right of innocent passage in internal waters. This is very important when we come to China, and we will discuss that in a minute. Beyond the maritime border of India, which is beyond the seaward limit of our territorial sea, we have high seas freedom. What is meant by this right of innocent passage? Try and imagine that you are standing on the border of India at the Trans-Himalayan region. Then a tank that you see will either be your tank or it will be the enemy's tank. It is highly unlikely that it is some Belgian tank which some Swedish guy decided to take for a test drive just there. But at sea, in this territorial sea as well, there is a right of every ship, including warships, to proceed on continuous passage so long as their activities are not prejudicial to the good order and safety and security of the coastal state. They are free to do so. They don't have to take permission. They don't have to take prior permission. If they are warships, then we ask that they notify. But if they don't, it's no big deal. And that is the rule position across the world. It's not some peculiar Indian thing. So now on the land, when you've crossed your national boundary, your country's sovereignty ends. But at sea, it doesn't end quite so easily. So from the baseline, when you draw another 24 nautical miles to seaward, you get what is called the contiguous zone. And here, you still have some laws, although they are only laws relating to security, finance, health, and immigration, which still apply. And beyond the contiguous zone, If you start from the same baseline and proceed up to 200 or 350 nautical miles, depending on whether you satisfy a certain number of conditions, then you have your exclusive economic zone, or your EEZ, or as the Americans like to say, the EEZ. And here, only such laws as relate to your exclusive right to exploit all living and non-living resources apply. And beyond 200 miles, up to 350 miles, only non-living resources and those living resources which live and dwell on the seabed but not move around in the water column. So the high seas, as you might have noticed, are defined as waters lying to the outer limit of the exclusive economic zone. But high seas freedoms, they apply in waters seaward of the territorial sea. And that brings up a host of complications which China tends to exploit by a process known as lawfare. Here you have high seas freedom of navigation, high seas freedom of overflight, laying of submarine cables and pipelines, the construction of artificial islands, etc., etc., etc. All is permissible. So it is very important to understand what is the extent of freedom of navigation on the exclusive economic zone, and is it the same as it is on the high seas? So basically, what is the EZ? Is it a unique body of water distinct from the high seas? Or is it simply a body of water within the high seas to which some special regulations apply? And because human beings tend to move from land to sea, they end up confusing the daylights of themselves. So I thought we would do it the other way around. Let's take that square marked in brown and surrounded by that pecked line, which is nothing. It is only indicating, drawing your attention to the square. That square represents land. Everything else is the sea. And everything else is the high seas, where you have full freedom of navigation, full freedom of overflight, full freedom of fishing, full freedom to exploit resources everywhere. Then, thanks to UNCLOS, then we place one rectangle upon this, which has some restriction. Now, this rectangle is the extended continental shelf, which can extend up to 350 nautical miles, where, yeah, we have full freedom of navigation. Yes, we have full freedom of overflight, but we have some restrictions on fishing and some restrictions on the
It seems he has a network issue, Admiral Chauhan.
of non-living resource. Then on this, we'll put another exploitation plus those restrictions imposed by the country in respect of customs, immigration, finance, and sanitation or health. Finally, you will put up one more, the smallest of these, and then that will be your territorial sea, in which freedom of navigation, no. It is restricted only to innocent passage. No freedom of overflight, no fishing, no exploitation of living or non-living resources, plus the full majesty of your country's law. Then, apart from that particular UNCLOS, there are other pieces of legislation which determine how nation states and their maritime entities will behave. For example, we have the Convention of the Suppression of Unlawful Acts, called the SUA Convention. This is a convention. It's a treaty. Has India signed? Yes. Has China signed? Yes. Have they ratified? Yes. What about the International Maritime Organization? Is that a convention? Yes. Have we signed? Yes. China signed? Yes. India ratified? Yes. China ratified? Yes. That determines and generates a series of laws and conventions. There's a convention on how to avoid collisions at sea, when ships meet each other at sea, What is supposed to happen? Who's supposed to go where? Should I turn to the right? Should I turn to the left? What lights should I show? What sound signals should I show? All this is laid down by the call regs or the collision regulations for prevention of collisions at sea. Have we signed? Yep. China? Yes. Ratified? Yes. China? Yes. Then there is the whole, which frequency is to be used when you meet up at sea? Do we need to develop some? No, we already have the International Telecommunications Union, and that is laid down. Okay, when you meet it, when you encounter somebody, which frequency on which frequency band? So in the case of VHF, very high frequency bands, you will be utilizing channel 16 for calling, for distress, for responding. Then you will switch. Procedures are laid down. Does China not know this? Yes, they do. What if you don't have any radio at all? Then there are international flags which are laid down as the International Code of Signals. Each flag has a meaning. Do we know that? Yes. Does China know that? Yes. What about the PLA Navy? Yes. What about their fishing fleet? Yes. What about their little blue man militia? Yes. Then suppose I don't speak the same language. You speak Chinese and I speak English. So then we have standard marine communication phrases that are standardized. Are these standardized and accepted by China? Yep. India? Yep. USA? Yep. Everybody? Yep. Then there are others of the safety of life at sea. How will you behave? Can you decide to enter somebody's territorial waters because you are engaged in search and rescue? Is that okay? Is that not okay? Does that need to be reworked out ab initio? Nope. All these are part and parcel, whether you're talking about marine pollution. Can you discharge at sea? Can you dump oil? What about on the high seas? Yes, no, all laid down. All conventions accepted, adopted, signed, and ratified. What about when you start to approach war? Even then, you have guidance documentation which is available and applicable uniformly. In this case, the San Remo Manual on International Law applicable to armed conflicts at sea. So what I wanted to actually emphasize is that the rules-based order that we are all seeking does not need any additional documents, nor will some additional set of documented commitments provide any guarantee of any meaningful change in the cavalier disregard shown by China. But there are these, we have diplomatic efforts which proceed apace, and then people say, even yesterday I heard people asking, can't we have some form of the Incidents at Sea Agreement, which had been signed in 1972 between the United States of America and then Soviet Union? What did that allow them to do, and why was it signed? First of all, remember 1972 is 10 years before UNCLOS got signed. 10 years before the IMO regulations began to be pumped out with the frequency which I've already mentioned. So here's a photograph of dangerous maneuvers at sea leading to collision between US warship and a Soviet warship. So here's the Soviet destroyer deliberately colliding with the USS Walker in the Sea of Japan. What's the year? 1967. When was UNCLOS signed? 1982. When did we ratify? 1995. So at that point in time, the situation was that the risk of global superpowers was high, but there were politically mature states. Yet the risk of an extremely rapid escalation from a tactical game of chicken played by carefully conditioned, aggressive, assertive, seagoing commanders, because you don't want sea lawyers at sea, and therefore you need guts. But guts, you also, that means you need Josh and you also need Hosh. So would we be able to move directly from a tactical game of chicken to a potentially global nuclear conflict? Yes. And at that point in time, this was correctly assessed to be very high, and therefore the personal involvement of the highest naval leaders of the United States of America and the Soviet Union signaled not only extreme gravity and extreme urgency, but also that civilian bureaucratic delays and obfuscation would not be brooked. Now, how does that work out in other areas? Let's take a look at that. In the Indo-Pacific, whether we take the western segment, that is the Indian Ocean region, or the eastern segment, which is the Pacific Ocean, not one of those three criteria for success of the INCSE agreement are present. And yet, the sheer seductiveness of extrapolating, even force-fitting a largely successful model remains so high as to drive the USA and its partners, and most especially ASEAN. So we have diplomats from all over the country trying to say, hey, Samjhauta, one more document, one more set of agreements. But I want to ask you something. How do you judge future behavior? You judge it based upon past behavior, isn't it? That means if in the past you gave me 22 chances and all 22 times I turned out to be a unreliable partner or a liar or a serial flouter of rules, and your expectations of me in the future will be governed by how I have behaved in the past. So past behavior is always the litmus test for determining future prediction of behavior. In the Indian Ocean, let me try and focus your attention to India and the Indian Ocean. The India-Pakistan relationship at a superficial level might even appear to mirror at least some elements of the US-Soviet one. And once again, giving rise to a feeling that in the 1972 INCSE agreement can be extrapolated. And this was done. So, in 1991, which was well after the UNCLOS had been signed, India and Pakistan signed an agreement on advance notice of military exercises. Amongst the many clauses of this agreement was clause 10. Naval ships and submarines belonging to the other country are not to close less than 3 miles from each other, so as to avoid any accident while operating where? In international waters. Combat aircraft will not fly within 10 miles, will not buzz. Buzzing means you actually adopt an attack profile and go really low and go bzzz over the ship. You will not do that because the ship has no idea whether you're fooling around or you're going to launch an attack. And therefore, we had all these. And then what happened? 1 decade later, in 2011, I'll show you what actually happened. Here's a video clip involving the INS Godavari and Babar. PNS Babar is 182. It is overtaking the Godavari on the Godavari's starboard side. So you can see the ship overtaking and getting closer and closer and closer. And actually what is happening is that first there's some view that, we are macho, and then there is a view, whoops, we're out of control. And so you will see that the two ships begin to now collide. And there go the nets. These nets are the safety nets for helicopter operations. Babar is now desperately trying to get out of the way, trying to move away, and you can see the angle between the two ships now increasing until Babar moves out. What is the point of my showing you this? That 1 decade later, despite all these agreements, we still had complete disregard for the rules that have already been indicated by me, which are legion. UNCLOS, SUA, IMO, the works. So outside of Pakistani shenanigans, The other countries of the Indian Ocean region, on the other hand, much like the countries of the South China Sea outside of China's aggressive and disruptive actions, they quite happily and responsibly use these set of internationally accepted rules, processes, procedures, and therefore they sustain maritime activity. It's not that every time we put to sea, there's some marauding, there's some pillaging, there's some rape, there's some robbery, there's some nothing of the sort. You know exactly what you're supposed to do when you're in sight of one another, when you're not in sight of one another, all of that. But not so with these two gentlemen. And therefore, I repeat that an insistence upon any additional signed commitment for narrower, sub-region specific commitment of good behavior. That means, I said, okay. The last 22 times I'm wrong, but this time I'm going to be a good boy. It is unlikely to be anything more than chasing a chimera, and it runs the very real risk of confusing activity with accomplishment. So activity, lots of activity. Diplomats are moving to and fro. Military officials are exercising diplomatic functions. There are signatures of documents. Activity, lots of activity. Accomplishment, duk. In other words, operation successful, patient dead. So let's take a look. Therefore, all these new ones, that is the Military Maritime Consultative Agreement of 1998, signed between the USA and the People's Republic of China. CUES, Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, signed by the United States, not just the United States, all countries of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, all navies. With whom? China. This is the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea. Was this required? Of course not. Of course it wasn't required. There are already existing regulations which everybody knows, everybody has signed on to, everybody has committed to, which will tell you if you suddenly come across a ship at sea, warship at sea, what are you supposed to do? Which frequency? How are you supposed to call? What voice message? What phrases are you supposed to use? But no. Therefore, this is once again activity. It's activity. Memorandum of Understanding between the Department of Defense of the United States of America and the Ministry of National Defense of the People's Republic of China regarding the rules for behavior for safety of air and maritime encounters. They're not known? Of course, they're known. Therefore, including what we now hear so much about in your press, in our press, in the ASEAN press, in the Indo-Pacific reportage, because, mostly I find that our TV channels are full of these breathless anchors who need to do some breaking news or the other. I often want to ask people, what have you been smoking, baby? And whatever it is, it's not good stuff. So, do we now need a new declaration of conduct in the South China Sea? Will a code of conduct help? What happened to all the existing ones? The problem is that China is embarked upon a policy of exceptionalism, which says all these rules are fine, they apply to you, they don't apply to me. And once you embark upon exceptionalism, by extension, the ones which you sign today will similarly be treated with cavalier disregard in the future. So what then is the answer? I think that the correct answer is not to do some ham-fisted exercise of economic sanctions, which hurt generally the people and not the regimes. But nations, according to the foundational theories of international relations or IR 101, nations, they behave exactly like human beings behave. So when you ostracize a nation, what does that mean? You ostracize a people. Suppose I call you to my house, okay? I call you for my party. You come for my party. All my politeness check boxes have been tick marked. And in the party, I don't talk to you. I ignore you. when you want to crack a joke, I say, excuse me, I'll just get some water. When you want to, this is called social ostracization. Nations feel this very, very acutely, just like human beings and individuals feel this very acutely. In China, unlike in the United States, unlike in India, there is a central concept known as face. In the USA, in India, we have concepts like honor. Don't we have honor? Izzat? Yeah. Do we have respect? Yes. But face, losing face, gaining face, threatening the loss of face is a peculiarly Chinese, Japanese, Korean obsession. And yet our study, our academic study of face is far from complete. And yet we are generating plans, processes, including this one. It says that imagine the loss of face if you were to be called for a conference, for an event, and not been given any, any bhav, as they say in Hindi, for your presence. That means, yes, you were invited. No, you didn't get to speak. No, we didn't give you much of a chance to ask questions. No, we didn't offer you the best canapes. Yes, we offered you some table wine, but not our best one. What are we doing? We are causing you a loss of face. And in the case of China, perhaps rather than economic sanction, social sanctions or social ostracization might be more likely to produce the desired behavioral change, if for no other reason than that nations, like individuals, they want to be liked. We all want to be liked. And when we get signals that we are not liked, it hurts us. We want to do something about it. And we can discuss this a great deal further, but that's what is meant by a rules-based order. And when you don't have a rules-based order, or if the rules that you are generating are not rules that have been arrived at by international consensus, but have simply been arbitrarily imposed by one or another country, in this case, India wants to have rules, but we don't want to have the rules which were generated in Beijing. We want to have the rules which we painstakingly hammered out over 9 years of deliberations, which led to the conclusion of the UNCLOS. Mind you, UNCLOS began in 1958 with the UNCLOS 1, that means the United Nations Conference on the Law of the Sea. That took 30 odd years. And if we now abandon that, I rather think that we will end up with no rules. And if you end up with no rules, then what happens? Then you have only two recourses of action. Number one, either you talk or you have military confrontation, because the nation has run out of any other option. That's why this rules-based order is quite so important, but that is also why simply asking China to sign another document is highly unlikely to be successful. I think I'll stop there and see if you have any comments, or we can have some discussion on the points that have been made by me. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Admiral Chauhan, for a wonderful lecture. You know, as I said, that we have followed a kind of series of lectures on maritime security, starting with Commodore Wasson, followed by a presentation by Admiral Sanatan Kulshrestha, and now by you, sir. And it has been wonderful to have you, give this lecture. Before I open it to questions, I have some kind of editorial comments, being the moderator. And I think you started by saying that in next 200 years, either India has to be a naval power or forget about being a superpower. And I like that. You know, when you do your planning, when you do your strategic planning, you don't do it for 5 years, you don't do it for 10 years. You start doing with a very long-term framework. And in the history of this world, there has not been a superpower that is not a naval power or maritime power. Because all our mercantile activities, all our commercial activities are based on our sea power. 71% of this earth is water. All our imports, oil, this, that, and our exports are through our merchant navy. And guarding our economic interests, yes, we have land border issues, we have, air power and all, but for a country to aspire to be a superpower, your navy cannot be the Cinderella of the armed forces. So there has to be adequate, actually, budgetary allocation and planning for the naval forces. That is number one. Number two, here is a very interesting parallel. I'm a psychiatrist by profession. The only predictor of future violence is past history of violence by an individual. Every forensic psychiatrist will tell you. And that dictum applies not just to individuals, but organizations and nation states. So I find it very interesting similarity between a psychiatrist and a sailor, saying the same dictum, using the same dictum. And I think it is a time-tested dictum, because hoping for yet one other, chance, giving, wink, wink, nod, nod, one other infraction, I think it reinforces the behavior. So there have to be consequences for behavior. Third thing I will, you had peripherally mentioned about South China Sea. I see that region of the sea as the sixth sea and part of Indo-Pacific region. So security and maritime issues in that region is very much a business of India. And I would actually call it the so-called South China Sea. I think you have to build a narrative. You have to use your own definitions. So if your adversary is doing certain things, sometimes you have to use the same tactics to deal with. So it is not South China Sea, it is the so-called South China Sea. It is also called Champa Sea by Vietnam. It's called North Natuna Sea by Indonesia, and it is being called West Philippine Sea by the Philippines. So we have to be terminologically exact when we set the international dialogue and not give a free pass to anyone or everyone. So that is my next comment. I know that ASEAN have been trying to work with China for mutual negotiation of a code of conduct. And that's not going anywhere. And China has used this time to build artificial islands and reefs and all. So it goes with your saying, that there's no need to have one more agreement. Before opening to my, viewers and audience, and questions are already there, how would you assess the United States' reluctance to ratify the UNCLOS in this context?
So I agree with all the editorial comments you made. There are really important features. I think it's really important for me to be able to once again emphasize what you did. And that is that what I said was that if India is going to be, either we're going to be a maritime power, That's not limited to the Navy. There are many aspects, as you've already indicated, lying outside of naval power, which are nevertheless maritime power. How large is your merchant navy? How good is your shipbuilding? How good is your ship repair? What is your bent of mind of the government and of the people? If I say beach, do you think Chowpatty, do you think Bhelpuri, or do you think, what comes to your mind? If I say pirates, do you think Johnny Depp, or do you think something more sensible? What is the bent of mind of the people? What is the size of your population, of your seafaring population? All these are features of maritime power. Navies are enabling instruments. They enable these other elements of maritime power to exist. They enable them to exist. They also prevent other people from using the seas in ways that are inimical to India. That's what navies do. Maritime power is a very, very, very important determinant of what we will be. Let me give you one little example of the South China Sea, and then I'll answer your question about the United States and the ratification or lack of. India's, we have $110 billion worth of trade. That is $60 billion worth of exports and $50 billion worth of imports every year going through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb near Yemen, Red Sea. So when that trade is impacted by, say, pirates or anybody else, the government of India reacts. And the Indian Navy has been on continuous deployment since 2008. What about the South China Sea? Let's talk about the trade there. In the South China Sea area, we have $180 billion worth of trade, not counting trade with Indonesia, not counting trade with Thailand, not with Malaysia, not with Singapore. These four are Indian Ocean countries. Outside of these countries, we still have $180 billion worth of trade. And therefore, anybody who says, what are you doing in the South China Sea and why are you interested, needs his head examined, or at least needs to do a course of 101 on trade. Therefore, now coming to the point of the United States of America not having signed and ratified UNCLOS. Even amongst large nations, there's no answer, sir, to stupid. Stupid is stupid. So why didn't the USA sign? Initially, it did not sign because it did not believe in the International Seabed Authority stipulations, which said that when you do deep sea mining, you can't apply the principle of differentiated capitalism simply because what about other countries? Don't they have a right to have any form of progress and economic advantage? Therefore, we will create this body. Let's say that India is a pioneer investor. India has pioneer exploration rights. We explore an area, let's say it's X by Y. 50% of that explored area is required by law for us to return to the United Nations, and within the United Nations, that 50% is kept by the International Seabed Authority for utilization by disadvantaged or less advantaged or less advanced countries. In the future, the USA said no. And because of that one feature, they said no. The debate is a continuous trade. Why don't you sign? The USA's response is we don't need to sign. We have incorporated every single clause of UNCLOS into our domestic legislation, which is more than you have done. When he says you, I mean India. So we said, okay, but it will give you the right to be on the same table. Now that you've incorporated everything into your domestic law, now it shouldn't matter whether you sign or not. So sign, because it still gives you residual advantages. I'm afraid that's all that I can say about the willingness or the right or the decision of another country. But I think that it is it's a self goal. Every time that the USA goes across and talks to China, and China says, first you sign, then we'll talk about your law. Unnecessarily positions you on the back foot. Thank you very much. And now I'm ready to take on the questions that you have.
I think we have a bunch of questions and I will go serially. I will also, in the interest of time and equity, we'll take one question from each audience, because I know there are multiple questions by some of our friends, and some of those questions can be taken later on, but I would like to give chance to everyone's questions. So I will start with the question of my friend, Dr. Arun Agrawal, who is sitting in New York City and is a pulmonologist. And this may be a basic question, but I will still air it. So he is asking about two scenarios, when there are islands next to each other, or if some country has an island, what it does to the EEZ, does it get extended by another 350 nms? That's the question, and that is the thing China is using in the so-called South China Sea, and using the 9-dash line that whole of this sea is our sea. So that is one question from Dr. Agrawal. And the second is, the situation when there are, Britain and France, etc., nearby each other. How do you define then the, or for that matter, like India and Bangladesh on the Bhashan Char or South Moor Island, the issue went to international tribunal. So how do you, demarcate the maritime boundaries kind of thing? So that is the gist of the question.
Thank you very much for that. Let me do some very quick responding, because we are tight for time. Let me try and differentiate for you between three entities. One is an island. An island is differentiated from a rock. Both an island and a rock have to be above high water at all times. That means some part of it must be exposed. If the rock, if it is exposed, it is either an island or a rock. Now, for it to be an island, it has to satisfy additional criteria. It must be capable of generating economic activity in and of itself, and it must be capable of sustaining life. When it is so, and an island is therefore an island, or a rock is therefore an island, now it has all the seas, that means all the zones. It has a territorial sea, it has an exclusive economic zone, it has a contiguous zone, it has all these zones. If it is an island, but let's say it doesn't meet the two criteria that I mentioned, then it is a rock. It still has a territorial sea, but it has no exclusive economic zones. What if it's a reef? What is a reef? So a reef is a really shallow part of the ocean, which sometimes above water, sometimes is below water. Is it a rock? No. Is it an island? No. So what does a reef have? A reef has nothing. Zero. What is an island on reef? Does that become an island? No, it doesn't. It remains a reef. And therefore, you can build an island, and now it will be classified as an artificial island, just as you would have built an artificial island, let us say, for the purposes of exploiting the seabed and extracting oil. So that sort of artificial island has only a 500-meter safety zone. So when you have islands, whatever distance they might lie from your coast, around that island, from that island's coast, you draw your 12 miles, you draw your 24 miles, you draw your 200 miles. And the rest of it is open sea between your coastline and the island's coastline. So let's take the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in India. They lie more than 400 nautical miles away from the mainland. And the intervening water, which means that you drew 200 miles from the coastline of India and you do 200 miles from the coastline of the Andamans, the western side of the Andamans. In between that, they didn't overlap. In between that, this is the high seas. Insofar as countries which are next to each other, they share what is called a median line principle. So it's just simple as they say, Adha tumhara, Adha mera. That Adha, that half, that halving is done by the processes of delimitation and delineation. These two processes are brought to bear, and on maps, on charts, divisions are laid down halfway between. That means suppose the distance between you and your country, Britain and France, was less than 24 miles. then your territorial sea is shared. India and Sri Lanka, India and Myanmar, they share a territorial sea. And what do? They divide that to say whatever is the distance at different points along the coast of each country, we will come to an equitable agreement of median line. That is how it is done. In the case of China and Taiwan, Taiwan does it exactly like that. China says that Taiwan is part and parcel of China. So there is a mess. It's a political disagreement which continues. I hope that answers the question. I think that Dr. Adityanji is having some difficulty. So with your some connection difficulty. So with your permission, may I go to the next question?
Yes, sir. Please go to the next question because I think Aditya is having some problem with his.
Yeah. So this is from Mr. Nilikani, which is how do you deal with a guerrilla navy or official piracy? Okay, I think a guerrilla navy is what we call these little blue men, which means that China is incorporating the fishing fleet, is incorporating the coast guard, is incorporating the maritime militia into its overall security establishment, and has therefore created a guerrilla navy. Piracy is a term that we should use with great care. So militias are what China is utilizing, and it's peculiar in that area that there are countries like Vietnam and China both have maritime militias. Many people say, shouldn't we also have maritime militias in other countries? And I think that this is a pretty much self-defeating option. What we need in India is to have a sound, solid navy and a sound and solid coast guard. I don't think we need anything more than that. And so when we deal in the South China Sea with China deploying, say, for example, white-hulled vessels, which is their coast guard, or multicolored hull vessels, which is their fishing fleet, and utilizing them for obviously security or military purposes, the answer lies in bringing to bear proportionate force. But remember that all coast guards, sir, do not have the same jurisdiction of place. The US Coast Guard has global jurisdiction. Indian Coast Guard has jurisdiction limited up to the 200 nautical mile limit of India. And therefore, Indian Coast Guard can't operate. It can operate, but it can't deploy in the South China Sea on operational missions. This is a really important feature to remember. It can do so, but then it must be the effective agent must be the Indian Navy, because while inside the maritime zones of India, the Indian Navy and the Indian Coast Guard work in seamless coordination. Outside 200 nautical miles, the Indian Navy is the sole maritime representation or manifestation of the sovereign power of the Republic of India. Only the Navy.
Thank you, Admiral.
I'm sorry. One of your.
I was somehow, because of some technical problem, I was kicked out of the program, so I had to rejoin, and I don't have access to the previous chat function. So I'll request you kindly read the question one by one and make sure that one question from each participant is answered.
Why doesn't USA have frigates, but India, Russia, even China have frigates? I think this is probably slight misinformation. The USA has many classes of frigates. Frigate is a type of warship, and the USA has several classes of frigates. It does. It has anti-aircraft frigates. It has general-purpose frigates. It has anti-ballistic missile frigates. So all of the countries have frigates. The next question is from Dr. Agarwal, which says that while there is no doubt a unified world approach to India, to China's active what do you think would escalate the pressure? I just mentioned exactly what I said. Call them for every conference and ignore them after that. Then conference takes place on the sidebar. And in the sidebar, you must inform them that, baby, if you continue to behave like this will be the response. So if you want to have voices, it will, to my mind at least, work. Does India currently have enough naval resources to protect its maritime interests? What is the maritime interest of India is the next question. So the maritime interest of India is the assurance of holistic security, that is freedom from threats arising in the sea, from the sea, through the sea. Do we have enough resources? No, we will never have enough resources. We will always have a shortfall. So does India have a significant shortfall? Yes, in some cases. So what should India be doing? India has no option but to follow the strategy that it is following, which is a strategy of constructive engagement. We say that, as Dr. Adityanji quite correctly and brilliantly in fact said, no nation, no post-Westphalian state has become a global hegemon without first simultaneously being a maritime hegemon. If China is to achieve a dream, nation states should never, ever make the mistake of putting a date by which something will happen. You should never do this. You should never, especially not if face is attached. For example, if we had the late President Abdul Kalam writing that India will be a superpower in 2020. 2020 is come and gone. Is India a superpower? No. So what happens? We just laugh and say not 2020, 3020. But in China, if they don't achieve their dream, they are in big trouble. And therefore, we look at China and say, if you want to be a global hegemon by 2049, then you have to be able to generate sufficient maritime power to best the combined maritime power of India, USA, Australia, France, much of the European Union, some parts of ASEAN. Are you going to do that? The answer is no. Then what will happen? Then, just like a child who is approaching his examination, China will start to make mistakes. What is our job? Our job is to understand what and identify what is a mistake. Which is a mistake? And then utilize that to not batter China, but to better China, to make China's behavior more in conformity with international norms. Admiral Commodore Vasan, your question says that while on the point of ostracization, and that is well taken, the rest of the world is not in a position to isolate China. Look, you are mixing up, sir, with due respect, you are mixing up trade and economics with social ostracization. Economic sanctions, economic ostracization is never going to be my case. As it is, we are, in fact, the globe is gradually attempting to provide alternatives to China. Will this take time? Yeah, it will take time, but it is in the process. What do you think is happening in China? The economy in China is in great trouble. It is in very big trouble. But so China, all these features act together to make China more cautious of the cavalier disregard it has for other functions. Collective coercive action takes time. Yes. What are we doing? Why did we go to Doklam? Why did we end up in Wuhan? Why? Because we are buying time. What is China doing? Buying time. The question is this: what are you doing with the time that you bought? Are you frittering it away? Or are you doing something? That is the question to be asked. Let me move on to the question from Kylie Marston. If India were to get a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, how do you think it would affect India's approach to maritime security in the next 200 years? I want to be at pains to point out, I am not talking about something that will happen in the next 200 years. That means not after 200 years, from today. So what will actually happen? India will seek in the Security Council to behave as a Security Council member ought to behave. That means with maturity. That means with dignity, with respect. What is the meaning of comity? It is mutual respect amongst nations. If we behave with the same condescension, with the same arrogance as does China, when the responses to us will be the same as the responses to China. So I think that India will seek to provide a more secure maritime environment, not only for India, but as you've seen in the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, this is not about India. India doesn't believe. Let me be quite clear, read my lips. India does not believe that the Indian economy can somehow magically float about on some economic crest while other economies of the region are wallowing in some economic trough. India believes that all economies will rise with a rising tide. And only when our region is secure will we be secure. At the UN Security Council, only when the globe is secure will each individual nation be secure.
Do you want to take the question by Dr. Sanat Kaul?
I've got a question from Dr. Sanat Kaul, yes. It is high time India puts its energy to safeguard the Bay of Bengal. We need to use our strategic advantage in the Nicobar Islands, especially the Great Nicobar, and use our hard or soft power for that. Besides using Nankauri Kamorta Natural Harbour, the Great Nicobar also offers a great advantage for soft activities. High value, low volume tourism is what the Supreme Court order states, but we keep following the high volume, low value tourism, and let the people of ASEAN and the rest of the world know that the Bay of Bengal is an Indian region. Let the people of the world know by visiting them by direct flights. And we need to get involved in safeguarding the Malacca Strait with neighboring countries. And we must also emphasize that India and maritime countries of the Bay of Bengal have settled their dispute by international arbitration, unlike in the South China Sea, with China refusing to do so. Last point, absolutely well conceded. That is exactly what we are doing and what we should continue to do. There are voices, okay? There are voices both in India and in the United States which ask India, deal with Bangladesh in the same way by withdrawing from international arbitration mechanisms. I think that would be a retrograde step in the extreme. Insofar as the Bay of Bengal is concerned, you are aware, sir, that we are the government of India and all of its organs, including the Indian Navy and its think tank groupings, are all emphasizing and concentrating upon BIMSTEC. And there are 22 meaningful projects in BIMSTEC. And I think that BIMSTEC is turning from a sleeping, somnolent, appendage to being actually at the center of our Bay of Bengal policy. But our policy is not limited to Bay of Bengal. So now coming to the issue of Nankauri and Great Nicobar and harbors and ports, it is very important to understand one thing, sir, that any government can direct its people to build a port in so-and-so location. But no government can direct trade come to my port. Trade will come where there is money to be made. Money is going to be made where there are efficiencies. And efficiencies are what you need to ensure. So when you decide to make a harbor in Car Nicobar, whom are you going to compete with? Are you going to compete with TUAS? Are you going to compete with the Port of Singapore? Are you going to compete with PTP? Yes, yes, yes. Okay. Let's put in place the efficiency matrices that will, or the elements of that efficiency matrix that will generate that kind of efficiency. It's not only deep harbor that you need. You need quayside infrastructure. You need jetty cranes. You need cranes that will reach across. What do you think is happening in Colombo? Colombo's got depth, but the breadth of a ship is so large that the crane in Colombo can't pick up the cargo from the far end of the ship. Now what do you do? And therefore, in Car Nicobar, in the Andaman and Nicobar, should we leverage it? Of course. Do we have smart shipping? Do we have fiber optic cable? Do we have skinware? Where are the human beings? Where is the investment of human beings? And if we are going to move large numbers of human beings from the mainland of India to the Andaman and Nicobar, what is going to be the social and societal impact? Doesn't that need study? And therefore, sir, it is not enough for us to concentrate upon science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We need to be informed by the social scientists. We need to be informed by anthropologists. We need all this. Then we are a power. Tourism.
Thank you very much, Admiral Chauhan. We are running short of time, so we will have to stop taking questions. But I'm going to take this opportunity to invite someone who has really not asked a question from, if he has, and that is Air Marshal Bajpayee. Air Marshal Bajpayee, do you have any questions or comment on, from a different perspective? You can unmute yourself, sir.
It's only that China, of course, is building up its resources in various islands close to Andaman Nicobar, and that poses a kind of threat to us, whether it is for the maritime navigation or from our forces and operation in the South China Sea, Indian Ocean. Now, what care and reaction we should, or you can call it action only, because action already been taken. They have already built up those resources and they are trying to catch more of its islands and trying to reinforce that and putting their forces. How do we check that?
The answer, of course, is what you've already said. That means that the Indian investment in the Andaman and Nicobar, and particularly the hard power investment, and within hard power investment, particularly two elements, namely, or three elements, namely, first, the largest reach, air power. Second, we must be able to deploy SSNs or submarine operations, but not surface vessels, because we would not want to put our assets in the area where they are covered by Chinese shore-based aircraft. Third, we must never allow the Andaman and Nicobar to be viewed as being capable of being threatened by Chinese fleet in being or amphibious task force in being. And therefore, you need to have quite a strong army presence, not in order to launch amphibious operations, but to prevent them from taking place or from being threatened. The answer to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands in hard power is exactly what at least from my perspective, is exactly this. Air power, number one, air power. Which organ operates the air power? We can keep debating this till the cows come home. But air power is required. Aerospace power is required.
Well,
Submarine power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Admiral Chauhan. Thank you very much, our viewers, both in United States and in India. This was a very informative and very mature discussion on the maritime security aspects of Indo-Pacific. So I thank you again. We will be again back next month for a distinguished lecture series. I can take the liberty of announcing the topic. We will be talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and its strategic implications in month of November's distinguished lecture oration. So with that, thank you once again, everyone. And we'll hope that you will continue to participate in the activities of the Council for Strategic Affairs. Namaskar.